You're listening to the Passion for the Paranormal podcast with Curry Stegan. Now with weekly episodes. Now sit back, relax, and free your mind and let Curry take you on a journey into the paranormal, the bizarre, and unexplained. And don't forget to subscribe to him on Apple or Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And now, here's your host, Curry Stegan.
Well, greetings, fellow truth seekers, and welcome to another episode of Passion for the Paranormal, bringing a passion for the paranormal to you. It's really good to be back here with you once again. I'm really excited to be able to share my next guest with you. He is Dr. Jeffrey Long, and Dr. Long is considered one of the foremost researchers on the subject of near-death experiences. I consider near-death experiences to be one of the most compelling types of phenomena that provide evidence of the afterlife. And I just wanted to share some real quick data that I found that was pulled from most of which was pulled from Dr. Jeffrey Long's research. And one of them is that of near-death experiences, there's of people who have reported nearly dying, so maybe they had a cardiac arrest and were resuscitated. Of all those people, 17% have reported having a near-death experience. Of 1,122 people surveyed by Dr. Long on his website, roughly 75% of those near-death experiencers indicated that they had more consciousness and alertness during their near-death experiences than they experienced during their normal everyday life. And only about 20% reported experiencing normal consciousness, and just a very, very small percentage reported having a little bit less than their normal everyday life. So I thought that was another kind of telling statistic. Another interesting one is that of the near-death experiencers, all these near-death experiencers that have been surveyed, about 45% have reported having out-of-body experiences as part of their near-death experience. Now, out-of-body would be somebody who's reporting like floating above their body as they're being operated on, or the medical staff is trying to resuscitate them. Oftentimes, these people are reporting not only seeing their bodies, but explaining to the doctors after they're resuscitated what they were watching them do, and seemingly impossible that they could have reported seeing that stuff. Another one is people who have reported having some sort of super normal type of vision during their near-death experiences. In other words, experiencing some extraordinary vision beyond the type of vision we have in everyday life. Roughly 65% of those people reported saying they had some supernatural vision during their near-death experience. Of those surveyed who had near-death experiences, over 54% have said they have resulted in large changes in their life, and 24.5% have said they saw moderate changes in their life as a result of their near-death experience. So pretty remarkable statistics in that roughly 80% report having some significant changes in their life as a result of their near-death experiences. And just another interesting statistic is that almost 96% of near-death experiencers say that their near-death experience was definitely real. So the overwhelming majority are saying that these experiences were absolutely real. In my new book, Walking in the Shadows of Strangers, I document my journey from a skeptic to a believer in the paranormal. I talk about my experiences doing paranormal investigating at over 20 haunted locations. If you'd like to check out my new book, you can find a link to order my book on my website at passion4theparanormal.com. Or you can simply type my name on Amazon, Curry Stegan, and you'll find a copy of my book pop up. So hopefully you'll check out the book. On the website, you can also catch up with some past episodes, sign up for a newsletter, and you can actually find links to some of my guest appearances on other podcasts talking about my book and my journey and my experience as a paranormal investigator. So hopefully you'll visit the website. All right, so I'm going to play this interview I had with Dr. Jeffrey Long from last week. Remarkable interview. I really, really think you're going to like this one. And thank you so much for tuning into the show. Okay, so my guest today is Dr. Jeffrey Long. Jeff is a medical doctor specializing in the practice of radiation oncology. And as a scientist, Jeff founded the Near-Death Experience Research Foundation in 1998. He wanted to know if near-death experiences were real by questioning the experiencers. He is the author of the New York Times best-selling book, Evidence of the Afterlife, The Science of Near-Death Experiences, and has appeared in several times in national media to include the O'Reilly Factor, NBC Today, ABC with Peter Jennings, The Dr. Oz Show, and the History Channel. As a result of he and his wife's research, they have amassed over 5,000 NDE cases from across the globe. Dr. Long, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, it's certainly a pleasure to be here. We have lots to talk about.
It's always been an absolute intriguing topic to me, that the topic of near-death experiences. And the more I delved into it, the more I think I became convinced that there is something to this, and that this phenomena is real. And especially as I started delving into your research on the topic and your book. But maybe if you could take us back a little bit and talk about how this journey began for you, how you got involved in wanting to research this topic, because you're a medical doctor, and I'm assuming there's a lot of people in the field that don't really give this topic a whole lot of credence. So how did it happen for you?
Well, sure. This was many decades ago. I was in my residency training for my medical specialty of radiation oncology, and I was in the medical library. This was before the internet, and we actually had bound volumes of our medical journals that we would have to review to find the information to optimally treat our patients with cancer. So I was going through the huge journal of the American Medical Association, and quite by accident found an article that had the term near-death experience in it. And I stopped, puzzled, because in all of my medical training, I was aware that you were either dead or not dead, and what's this near death and having an experience. So having never heard the term before, and again, we're talking about the early 1980s here, I read the whole article and was immediately fascinated. Here was a cardiologist, Dr. Sabom, who was describing his research of patients that had a cardiac arrest, their heart stopped. And at that time, when there should be no lucid organized memory possible, there's no blood flowing to the brain, these patients did, and they described with stunning accuracy what was going on around them. And I knew immediately as a physician that was medically inexplicable. There's no way that could be happening unless their consciousness really was apart from their body and they really were making the very accurate descriptions described. So fascinated, I broke off from my search for my cancer related article and read some of the articles in the bibliography, and immediately was just absolutely intrigued. I mean, how can one not be fascinated about the basic question of what happens after you die? So I became resolved to try to learn more about this. And several years later, when I was out of residency, I set up a website, the Near Death Experience Research Foundation, NDERF.org. I was so intrigued, I wanted to go to the original source of data, that being people that had these near death experiences, and answer for myself that burning question: are near death experiences for real? Well, of course, that was a long time ago. And after looking over thousands of near death experiences shared with having filled out very detailed questionnaires, the answer, based on a mountain of evidence, is unequivocally near death experiences are, in a word, real.
Yeah, doctor, have you had a lot of people in the medical field, other doctors, question this research? Or, you hear sometimes people say that, well, the brain, the synapses are still firing,
as the brain starts to die away, maybe those synapses are still firing. Maybe people are having some memories. I mean, have you got some objections to this based on those kinds of arguments?
Not as many objections from the medical field as you'd imagine. And here's why. I literally did my work in secret for many, many years. On the NDERF.org website, I was Dr. Jeff with no other identifying information available. And again, I did that deliberately because I didn't want to offend doctors, patients, and I just wanted to do this in secret and not create an issue. However, my first book that came out, Evidence of the Afterlife, the Science of Near-Death Experiences, that became a New York Times bestseller within 8 days. And so obviously I couldn't stay in the closet after that. It was extremely widely known immediately in the hospital. And it was considered such a powerful book and so full of evidence that I think even if doctors wanted to quibble with me about it, they realized the strength of the evidence I presented, and they couldn't quibble with me because the evidence was so powerful presented in that book. The doctors, I think, knew full well the evidence I presented in that first book, Evidence of the Afterlife, was so strong from near death experiences, showing that there really is an afterlife, a wonderful afterlife, that they realized that strength of that evidence was actually greater than most of the body of evidence we have to make our usual day-to-day medical decisions. So that's how strong the evidence was. So overall, with very few exceptions, the reception in the medical community, even speaking to medical groups and the grand rounds, which is sort of a big formal medical gathering, has been extremely positive, which I've really appreciated. And again, you mentioned that possibility of, well, couldn't this be a dying brain? And you mentioned synapses, which gets back to the classic skeptical argument. Could this be electrical, neurochemical processes going on in the brain? In all the lines of evidence I have, none of that is explainable by a dying brain. For example, near-death experiences, typical near-death experiences occur while they're under general anesthesia. And at that time, it's well documented when their heart stops, because that's what anesthesiologists do during surgeries. And yet, at that time, under general anesthesia and the heart stopping, they still have typical near death experiences. That is, if you will, doubly medically inexplicable that near death experiences are explained by physical brain function. And that's just only one out of many, many lines of evidence, all converging to the reality that near death experiences are not due to physical brain function.
Yeah, it certainly brings into play the whole idea that perhaps consciousness is not just local to the brain. And I know that you've done a lot of research into this topic in near death experiences. Have you also looked into the out of body experiences where, say, somebody's under general anesthesia, but they're not dead and they have a out of body experience where they describe stuff going on the operating table? And if so, does that kind of dovetail with the near death experience research?
Right. We have probably scores of such experiences, certainly dozens. We label them anesthesia experiences because they're not near death experiences, because it's not documented that they nearly died. Given, out of thousands and thousands to have, it's probably several dozen of these anesthesia experiences, it's a little bit mysterious. There's certainly some consciousness existing apart from the body. They certainly seem to be as accurate as near-death experiencers in describing what goes on in the operating room, and yet there's no clear documentation they died. Now, there could be on the operating room table, now there could be a couple explanations for that. One of them is if their heart stopped even for a period of seconds, they may be quickly resuscitated in the operating room, and nobody may have told them anything about that. So they may actually have had a life-threatening event that their medical team didn't tell them about. And that was especially common decades ago, when the healthcare team would be reluctant to tell them they had trouble during surgery. So that's part of the explanation. The other part of the explanation is we just don't know. Anesthesia awareness, or when people start to come out of general anesthesia, it's typically auditory experiences. In other words, they're hearing only. They often have unpleasant sensations. They don't have consciousness apart from the body. So looking at the descriptions of this so-called anesthesia awareness, that doesn't seem to explain this at all. So ultimately, we just don't know. Now, there are a whole number of other people that have had what we label as spontaneous out-of-body experiences. that occur under circumstances where they're not under general anesthesia. And those seem to, once again, in the series we have, and these are up to hundreds, they don't seem to have the, well, put it this way, they seem to have the same accuracy of ongoing earthly events around them while they're asleep, while their eyes are closed, while they're meditating, while they're just, literally going about their daily life, and often with observations that they could not possibly have made otherwise without that consciousness being apart from their body, typically above their body.
Yeah, I want to talk about the actual NDE cases you and your wife Jody have amassed. Sounds like it's over 5,000 cases on the website. What time period are we talking about? Did this start in 1998 when you started recording these cases, and how long of time period do these cases cover?
Right. In late August 1998, NDERF, which is NDERF.org, the Near Death Experience Research Foundation, went live. It had what I would consider today a primitive questionnaire, as we encourage people to share both their experience and answer some questions. This was back in an era where it was hard to get on the internet. It was modem driven. It was buggy. There was a lot of technical problems with running a fairly sophisticated website with a questionnaire. So even though we started basically at the end of August, it was early December before I was able to successfully download the first batch of a little over 20 experiences, a little over 20 people that had responded to the survey. And immediately upon reviewing that, I realized, wow, there's something going on here. This is something outside of anything that would seem to be medically explicable. So that was the humble origin. We got off to a very fast start. We had, back in that era, in the early, well, actually, that'd be the late 1980s, there was a nighttime radio show that was a dominant nighttime show called the Art Bell Show. And because I was in Las Vegas at the time and Art Bell was in Pahrump, Nevada, very close to Las Vegas, I'd be on about every 3 months and replayed about every 6 weeks. So very, very quickly, we had a mammoth awareness of our NDERF website and huge numbers of people sharing their experience because of that huge public awareness back in that era. So we got off to a very, very strong start. And that was an important part of amassing such a huge number of near-death experiences.
And there's other researchers out there. I think Raymond Moody was one of the early, if you want to say, pioneers of looking into this phenomena. How has your research, I know Evan Alexander's another, he's actually an experiencer. How has your research, say, differed from the existing body of research out there already?
Right. Raymond Moody wrote Life After Life in 1975, and that touched off public awareness of near-death experience. In fact, that was the phrase near-death experience was basically coined by Dr. Moody back in that era. Once Dr. Moody did that, he's written a number of other fascinating books, which are certainly highly recommended about his research. And then certainly Dr. Evan Alexander. By the way, I know both of these personally, Dr. Moody and Dr. Alexander, wonderful, wonderful people. Both of the one thing that separates my research from theirs and all other near-death experience researchers is just the enormous volume of data I have. I mean, we have, I always tell people we're over 4,000 near-death experiences in our archive, but I think we're probably getting awful close to 5,000, if not surpassing that. And then above and beyond that, especially in modern years, the near-death experiencers fill out a huge survey. It's got over 80 questions. So we not only have a huge number of people that share their near-death experience, but we go into great depth with the survey. And then finally, on top of that, wife Jody translated our NDERF website working with human volunteers, had translated into over 30 different languages with the questionnaire. So as a result of that, we can do by far the largest cross-cultural study of near-death experience that's ever been possible. So from that mammoth volume of data and the cross-cultural study with near-death experiences literally from all around the world, is really a very unique data set. It's orders of magnitude greater than any other scientifically gathered body of near-death experience. And these are, by the way, when we talk about near-death experiences, these are near-death experiences that by my medical determination, occurred at the time of a imminent life-threatening event. In other words, this just wasn't a chronic illness, and all of a sudden they had an experience. These aren't experiences where they were just asleep or something. They were literally in a life-threatening event, and at that time had an experience detailed enough that it scored 7 or higher on the near-death experience research scale called the NDE scale, which is another way of validating that an experience is a near-death experience as opposed to something else. So we have a fairly stringent entry criteria for our experiences we call near-death experiences, and yet with that stringent criteria, we still have that many.
Now, Dr. Long, anybody you know personally that has had a near-death experience, or are all these just from your research you've done?
Well, I mean, I know some people we've had, as a physician, we've had patients and often family members share their near-death experiences. Not real often, and because of privacy rules, I can't really identify them or really use them in my research. If they want to fill out the website survey, we post it anonymously, so nobody can identify them. But yeah, I've had quite a few people that I've run into, mainly professionally, not so much friends and family, but as far as patients and family members of patients, quite a few over the years.
Yeah, and I know a individual who actually clinically was dead for, I don't know, seconds, if not minutes, and was resuscitated. And his response to me as we got into the discussion about near-death experiences was, I didn't experience anything. It was total blackness. Do you have some cases where people report that nothing's happened to them at all?
Sure. Actually, you need to know that over the decades, multiple researchers have all converged on the understanding that at the time of a close brush with death, when you nearly die, only about 10 to 20% of people will have a near-death experience. That means 80 to 90% don't. And we're not 100% sure why, at least in terms of uh, conventional scientific exploration into that question. But there's no doubt about it. You either pretty much remember nothing or only fragmentary memories, or you have a full-blown near-death experience. And there's really not a lot of in-between ground. A lot of people have shared that they, over the years with our website, that they nearly died, and it's interesting. They can still have often some significant life changes. Regarding that very interesting question about why some people have near-death experiences when they nearly die and why don't, I puzzled about that for years, and then finally had a near-death experiencer share their, we'll call it NDE, and I think it may well have contained the answer. In this near-death experience, this person was having a fantastically blissful experience, overwhelmingly positive emotions, which the great majority report during near-death experiences. This person was in the presence of God, which is described about 10 or 15% of the time. And this person was so thrilled with their vision and being aware of God and the positive emotions that she asked God, why me? What makes me so special that I should have this, referring to her near-death experience. And I think God's answer may have answered why some have NDEs and some don't. God answered, love falls on everyone equally. Everyone is special. This is what you needed to live your earthly life. And I think that response in that near-death experience is, to the best of my knowledge, the best explanation as to why some people have near-death experiences and some don't.
Yeah, the other thing that I'm curious about is you are obviously amassing cases from people across the globe, different backgrounds, different cultures. You would think that the experiences would be vastly different based on cultural differences and people's worldview of things. Have you found in the data, based on all these different cases, that there are a lot of similarities in the cases?
Yeah, the similarities far outweigh the differences. I actually published that relatively recently where we compared non-Western near-death experiences that were shared in English. That was important because they seemed to have enough grasp of the English language to handle a complex survey, and that seemed to be the most reliable comparison group to typical near-death experiences that occur in English-speaking areas of the world that are Western near-death experiences. And in this study, we found we had, oh gosh, we had probably about 30 or 40 non-Western near-death experiences. So it was a decent sized study. And we compared the responses to survey questions that addressed things that actually occurred during the near-death experience, elements, characteristics, if you will, of the near-death experience. And out of about 33 survey questions that were addressing these characteristics, things that occurred during the near-death experience, just about all, except maybe three or four, were not statistically different between the two groups. And most of the other questions were that were there was a difference between Western and non-Western near-death experience responders were of borderline statistical significance, or could be explained by the wording of the question, where it got into concepts like the word spiritual appears in the question, or concepts that might not translate well, or where people that could even be in a non-Western country speak English, and the meaning may not be clear to them. So the bottom line is about 90% of the questions, no statistical difference between Western NDEs and non-Western NDEs. Moreover, if you actually read the near-death experience narratives from non-Western countries and Western countries, it's obvious that there's much more strikingly similar than dissimilar. Now, of course, when you encounter, say, for example, deceased loved ones, they're going to be deceased loved ones in your culture. Americans would encounter deceased American relatives that typically are found in near-death experiences, whereas non-Western near-death experiences, it would be, imagery from their life in a non-Western country. But as far as the actual characteristics of near-death experiences, strikingly similar, oceans apart around the world.
Yeah, that's what I found truly remarkable about NDE cases as well. A lot of blissful experiences, and I think you've indicated that the majority of them seem to be that way. Is that correct? That most people are actually reporting kind of more of a blissful experience?
Yeah, actually, the overwhelming majority. Now, near-death experiences may have some frightening aspects, but there's two different ways to look at frightening aspects in near-death experiences. One is a subjective fright, and one is objectively, if you will, unpleasant realms. The subjectively frightening near-death experiences are, for example, there's a person who coded, their heart stopped, and so he was resuscitated, and an ambulance was rushing him to the hospital. So while he was in the ambulance, he had a near-death experience, and his consciousness was above the ambulance, paralleling the ambulance's journey toward the hospital. And while he was there with his out-of-body experience, consciousness apart from the body, angels appeared. And there were several angels. And while most everybody would say, oh, that's beautiful, what a great part of your near-death experience. Well, they frightened him, and he was batting at the angels. So that's subjectively frightening. It's not really objectively frightening. It's just he felt fright at that time because obviously it seemed so unfamiliar. Not only the angels, but the whole circumstance of his consciousness being apart from his body, where I'm sure he was aware that it was undergoing an imminent life-threatening event. Objectively frightening near-death experiences are, if you will, the hellish or frightening realm. And those are very, very rare. In the entire thousands of near-death experiences we have, I've only found about several dozen that seem to actually have hellish attributes to them. In fact, I co-authored a scholarly article with many, many other near-death experience researchers recently published in the Proceedings of the New York Academy of Sciences. And our consensus was, as a group, these are so rare that it's legitimate to question if these hellish near-death experiences are real at all. And I think that's still certainly, I think they are based on the several dozen I have, but I do acknowledge the fact that they're so rare, it's very difficult to learn much about them because we have so few to study compared to the far more common pleasant near-death experiences.
Yeah, that's interesting. And the other thing I wanted to ask is how many, well, let me maybe ask it this way. Have there been a lot of people who perhaps their worldview was that maybe it's an atheist worldview, maybe it's that there is nothing that happens in this aside from this earthly existence, and then they experience near death experience? Have you had a lot of cases like that where people have their whole view of things has changed as a result of their near-death experience and had no belief in an afterlife prior to that?
Sure. Glad you asked that, because our most recent version of the survey asked directly about their religious belief at the time of their near-death experience and at the time they shared it, which is a median and average of about 15 years later. So part of the self-religious classification that they fill out on the survey is atheist at the time of their experience or at the time they shared their experience. So we have a fairly significant population of people who self-described as atheist at the time of their near-death experience. As you might imagine, the great majority of them do not describe themselves as atheists at the time they shared their experience. 15 years later, they've had a chance to digest it, learn from it, grow from it, and are no longer considering themselves atheists. Among the subgroup of people that self-defined as atheist at the time they had their near-death experience, among those that encounter God, none of them are atheists at the time that they shared their experience, with, interestingly, exactly one near-death experiencer who's an exception out of that population. So a near-death experience seems to cure atheism to a substantial degree.
Yeah, that's one of the things that fascinates me as well, is people who have no belief in an afterlife and then have these experiences seem to be transformed a bit by their experiences. And then the other thing that I wanted to kind of get into is the after effects
Yeah.
of this, and they seem to be pretty telling. Talk a little bit about the after effects people report having as a result of these experiences.
Right. After effects is a major scholarly topic of investigation in near-death experience. There's been scores of articles written regarding that. Very consistently in my research and in others, you see a very consistent pattern of changes after people have a near-death experience. And these are very significant, as you note. As one person said, you can't fake an after effect. In other words, a substantial change in your life, evident not only to the person who had the near-death experience, but everybody around them, is telling, very much telling, that the near-death experience was understood as real by the person that had it. You don't make a huge life change to an experience that you doubt or certainly believe is unreal. And yet, with people having near-death experience, they have a very consistent pattern in changing of their beliefs and value. Some of the more commonly reported are, not surprisingly, an increased belief in an afterlife and decreased fear of death. Well, that's not a surprise, is it? From the person having a near-death experience, they know what lies beyond death's door, and it's wonderful. But in addition to that, they become increasingly loving and increasingly expecting of that in their relationships. They become less materialistic. They become more interested in spiritual things. And so all of that's manifest not only in their interpersonal relationships, in their vocations. If they're in a vocation where they can't really appropriately manifest loving relations with people around them, they may leave that vocation. We do have a number of near-death experiencers who left what they considered to be vocations where they couldn't express their new values and entered the healing professions, nurses, for example. So that's certainly common, and they may leave unloving interpersonal relationships where, as they may have tolerated an unloving, distant, at times even hostile interpersonal relationship with a significant other, they may break that off and seek more fulfilling relationships that are more appropriate for their newfound value of love and compassion toward all things. So this is things that you see over and over for people that have had near-death experiences. And these changes, in fact, we've asked some very direct survey questions, and it is astounding the shift in people's attitudes and values in these beliefs that I've just discussed here. I mean, they're far more likely to believe in God, be interested in spiritual matters, believe in life after death than they did at the time of their near-death experience.
Yeah, one of the other things that I've heard talked about in near-death experiences, people experiencing having some sort of life review. Have you had a lot of
Correct.
involving that?
Yeah, that's about 15-20% or so of near-death experiences describe a life review. They are fascinating. In a life review, they may, of course, don't forget, they're clinically unconscious or even physically dead with no measurable heartbeat or breathing. And yet at this time, they may become aware of part or even all of their prior life up until the time of their near-death experience. And this is often described, a common scenario is like a movie with many scenes flashing on a wall where they can see episodes from their prior life. It's absolutely amazing to me that they may be very aware that all of their prior life was reviewed, even though they're unconscious or clinically dead in minutes, and yet they're reviewing decades of their prior life. An excellent example of the huge acceleration of consciousness that's often described in near-death experiences. And may I add, when they have a life review and they see like early childhood memories come flood, it's more than just memories. I mean, they're like often just, they may see it or they may actually sense they're reliving it. So when they become aware, for example, of very early childhood memories, even memories they'd long forgotten, if they check out what they became aware of during their near-death experience with their parents, almost invariably those long forgotten memories are validated. They really happened, that they became aware of in their life review, which again is, yet another line of evidence for the reality of near-death experiences.
Yeah, the other thing I wanted to ask is, does their fear of death change as a result of these experiences?
Oh, absolutely. And that's a survey question we have in our most recent version of the survey. We check directly about their level of fear of death at the time of their near-death experience and then at the time they share their near-death experience. And that is a whopping drop in people that are very afraid of death, drops down to like a few percent. And people that have no fear of death drops off, raises from maybe 20-30% of the people stating that they had no fear of death at the time of their near-death experience to about 80% of people that share at the time of their at the time they complete the survey, with most of the rest beyond that 80% saying they may not fear death, but they fear death only a little bit. So that's one of the most dramatic after effects of a near-death experience, is that reduction in the fear of death. Again, no surprise when you think about it. From the near-death experience perception, the person who had that experience, they know exactly what happens when they're going to die, and that is there's an afterlife, a wonderful afterlife. And so certainly that while they may fear the dying process, and that's a natural earthly thing to fear, what lies beyond the death, what lies in that afterlife, nothing to be afraid of at all.
Yeah, we're a bit short on time, Dr. Long. If you could share the website and where people can find out more about your work and what you're doing.
Sure. The Near Death Experience Research Foundation we've been talking about is NDERF.org. That is by far the largest publicly accessible collection of near-death experiences in the world. We post every single near-death experience that's shared with us if they give us permission, and over 95% of the people having near-death experiences do. So that is the most objective source of information, reading the experiences themselves, that you can possibly have. And by the way, for your listeners, if you go to the NDERF.org website, go to the link at the top. Under experiences, there's a link to exceptional experiences. And all you have to do is read like even 10 near-death experiences posted there. And I think that could significantly change your worldview. The most dramatic, exceptional near-death experiences we have are absolutely mind-boggling. And that's my statement as a researcher, having done this over 20 years.
Yeah, and it's certainly probably the most compelling phenomena I think I've looked into. I've been involved in the paranormal investigation world for a number of years. Near-death experiences seems to be the most compelling phenomena and evidence of there being something beyond this earthly existence for me, and it's just absolutely fascinating topic. And really appreciate you taking the time to join me today. And great work, and really looking forward to delving into it and reading more about this topic. I really think it's just an intriguing topic, and really appreciate you joining me today, Dr. Long.
Yeah, it's been a real pleasure. Great interview here today. Yes, absolutely. I absolutely agree. I've been a student of like you, of the paranormal, and I am absolutely convinced that near-death experience is the strongest evidence for the reality of life after death. So it's really been a pleasure talking with you today. Greatly appreciate it.
All right. Thank you.